Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our webinar on securitization of migration. My name is Fátima Amante and I am a researcher at CAPP, Center of Administration and Political Policies, and a professor of anthropology. This webinar was organized with my colleague Maria João Ferreira and is part of PopMob, Population and Mobility Research Line activities. As for our methodology, we invited two speakers whom I will present in a moment, and thank a lot for being here with us. They will address the issue for more or less 20 minutes each, and then we open for discussion, asking the audience to contribute with questions on the comments box. Me and Maria João will take note of them. Our focus today is the migration security nexus, a hot timeliness topic of the discussion both in academia and society. Migratory flows toward Europe have been, since 2010, a very persistent topic in political agendas. The increasing visibility of migration flows through the Mediterranean Sea and from the sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa countries, reaching the shores of countries such as Italy, Greece, or Spain, turned the Mediterranean into the border of Europe and the place of death for many migrants. Repeatedly, we hear journalists, politicians, and regular people referring to this drama as a crisis, with a sense of danger associated to migration and a problem to be contained. The COVID-19 pandemic somehow superseded migration as a prominent topic of political agenda. However, a month ago, our attention was once again drawn to the very strong images in the Spanish enclave of Ceuta. So we took the opportunity to discuss it today by asking some questions. If migration is not on the top of political agenda, as it was a few years ago, does it continue to be securitized? How does securitization of migration take place? Who are the actors in this process? Who can play the role in constructing migration as a security issue? And why is migration constructed in this way, as an issue which needs extreme measures to be contained? And to whom? Who is the audience you are talking to? And what strategies are put in place to succeed in convincing the audience that migration is such a problem? To help us to think about the topic, we invited two speakers whom I will present now. Eeva-kaisa Prokkola is professor of geography at the University of Oulu and holds a title of docent in human geography and southern border studies at the University of Eastern Finland. She has extensive experience in conceptual and empirical studies of borders, border regions, border management, securitization, and special identity and mobility issues. She has published widely on European internal and external border regions in internationally acclaimed journals and book volumes, and she has served as an expert in several international panels and journals. In 2020, she published an article entitled Geopolitics of Border Securitization, Sovereignty, Nationalism, and Solidarity in Asylum Reception in Finland, whose topic is, of course, at the heart of our event. Our second invitee, Ruben Andersson, is a well-known anthropologist working on migration, borders, and security, with a focus on Western African Sahel and Southern Europe. His book, Illegality Inc., Clandestine Migration and the Business of Border in Europe, which our students of anthropology are very familiar with, an ethnographic account of European efforts to halt irregular migration, accompanying border agents, aid organizations, and migrants along the Spanish borders were the top. The book shows that the fight against irregular migration has full distress and drama at the borders, which in turn has led to the expansion of a self-reinforcing industry of controls. So, thank you so much for being here with us, and I welcome you once again the floor is now yours. So, Eeva-kaisa, if you wish, please begin.
Okay, yes, thank you. So thank you very much for introducing me, and it's really an honor to be with you today. I will now try to share my slides and as Maria mentioned, I have been writing something about securitization, and mainly from the perspective of border securitization. But since border securitization can be, or border security interventions can be very much understood as a part of migration securitization, and in border studies, migration has become a very big issue and a major question, and they cannot be kind of separated. So that's how I understand securitization and how I approach securitization in my presentation, like border migration dynamics is very important here. And my research is based on a wider project where I was participating in 2005-2019, and I was doing field work in the town of Tornio, and focusing on this kind of border security interventions and threat narratives and imaginaries of fear, and that was a very topical question after 2005 and the long summer of migration in Europe, what Stephen Steele calls a long summer of migration. And in this presentation, I will first speak shortly about the European migration in 2015 and how it was experienced in Finland. Then I will introduce my securitization multiple perspective, and then I'm going to show how it works at different levels. I will speak about state border intervention at the Finnish-Swedish border, and then nationalism and the far right in this same context, and how it created social polarization, and how local people at the Finnish-Swedish border were experiencing that. And then I will go back to the question of European solidarity and neighborhood relations. So in 2015, European countries were seeing very high numbers of refugees and asylum seekers. It was not a surprise, or it should not have been a surprise if they had followed the development. But in Finland, it was a very big change, because Finland has been a country of low migration, and it has a very short migration history. But in 2015, migrants from Southern Europe traveled through Europe and Sweden all the way to Finland. And the Dublin regulation and agreement stipulating that a migrant's country of entry into the European territory is the country that is responsible handing of his or her asylum claim was emptied, and all European countries just let refugees and asylum seekers to pass their territory and to move to other countries. And so in 2015, Finland received over 32,000 asylum applications. And this number is not very high in the European scale or compared to Sweden or Germany. But in Finland, the number was tenfold compared to previous years. And it meant that there was no infrastructure and there was no capacity that was that people didn't know how to handle the situation. And most asylum seekers arrived via northern border crossing point in Haaparanta, Tornio, from Sweden to Finland, because it was the land border and it was therefore the border that they could cross without any documents. For example, if you are traveling by plane or by train or boat, you would need documents and it's more complicated. But it was a very big surprise in Finland that has been always talked that in Finland it has been understood that Sweden is much more attractive destination, and this direction of migration was not expected. So this is the context of my research, and I have been writing a few papers from the perspective of securitization and also from the perspective of resilience. But in this paper or this presentation, I will focus on securitization. And I was trying to conceptualize the move beyond this kind of state-centric and discourse-centric understanding of securitization that, for example, in Copenhagen school, it's based on discourse and how a discourse names and creates a threat. But I was also trying to see what happens at the local level and at the level of practices. But the point of departure is that the definition of both leaking borders and migration flows, so to say, they are seen or presented as a security problem. And this kind of understanding mobilizes a specific understanding of the world, and it dehumanizes migrants and helps to justify intensified border controls and the building of new border walls. And securitization is always a highly political and politicized act. And in this presentation and in the paper, I'm kind of trying to move away from this straightforward understanding of securitization as a state effort, and seeing it more also as a set of performed practices enacted by state authorities and other governmental and also non-governmental actors, and sometimes in partnership with each other, but also in a contradictory manner. I will show some examples in the next slides. So the state intervention at the Tornio-Haaparanta border crossing point started a few weeks after the first bigger groups of asylum seekers had arrived. And it meant that the Finnish government relocated hundreds of security personnel, including police, border guards, and also military servicemen at the border crossing point. And especially in Sweden, there was a strong reaction towards this servicemen and military personnel, and a lot of critique, both at the national and at the local scale. So the Finnish state did not intervene Schengen border controls because most resources were kind of fixed at the Finnish-Russian border, that is European external border, and it's of course of high priority. So what Finnish state did was that they put this kind of intensified controls of foreign nationals into operation. And of course, there it's a little bit problematic because it's often based on ethnic profiling, which is forbidden. And of course, there were many kind of threat imaginaries circulating in the media. And also many politicians were in a way participating in that kind of creation of threat imaginaries. For example, the Minister of the Interior, who is responsible for border control and the Finnish border guard, the minister said that at some point the carrying capacity of Finland is met, meaning that a state has a certain limit that it cannot be exceeded, otherwise the state would somehow collapse or lose its functioning or something like that. And it was of course because nobody was actually knowing that how many people would come, but also that in Finland there is a lot of xenophobia and racism and this kind of problems, but this was like a rational way of arguing that no, we cannot take so many, that there is a certain carrying economic and social and cultural capacity, how many people can come to Finland. And at the same time, or right after that, there was also this kind of activation or mobilization of national minded people and far-right groups in Finland. And this far-right extreme groups, they were claiming that the Finnish state is not doing enough to secure and to protect its citizens, and it's not capable of protecting its citizens. So they were arguing that they have to act. So they were organizing through social media many demonstrations, this kind of close the border demonstrations, and also street patrols. But what did that meant that the securitization of the border and border security intervention and migrations securitization through it became an arena for contesting the rule of the state authority of security, of providing security from the ground up. And this created a lot of social tensions in Finland and in Tornio. Here you can see these soldiers of Udin. I think this is a Nordic movement that is really much kind of, it has an old Viking name, and it's very ethno-nationalist group. And this meant that this border town that was the key road to Finland, Tornio-Haaparanta, became a very securitized environment to take care of and welcome asylum seekers. And local people were first happy that the state came and took control and there was a clear rule. But soon, when there was this far-right activism, it became very heated atmosphere, and especially for these non-governmental organizations and volunteers who were trying to help and assist asylum seekers, it was directed at them, and there was specific also a gender dimension that most volunteers and non-governmental organization workers like Red Cross, they were female, and this nationalist far-right activists and security personnel were men. And some of these women who I was interviewing, they had been experiencing some harassment or this kind of threat speech, that they are like, they shouldn't do, it's morally wrong for them to help these asylum seekers. But on the other hand, in the interviews, many actors who were participating in the asylum reception, they were actually telling stories how they felt like that they felt that they were empowering themselves. And one woman even said that, oh, it was so somehow exciting, and she felt so important that she hoped that it could start again, so she could be that important person who would help other people. So actually many local people who were actively participating in the asylum reception they were very positive, and their stories were very positive. And it was a big surprise to me when I had been following this narrative of threat and chaos from the media. And at the local level, those people who were closest to migrants were actually very positive, and many of them highlighted that no, migrants and asylum seekers, I didn't feel any threat among them, but then it was this atmosphere of nationalism and xenophobia that was the security threat for them. And then it was very important in this everyday asylum reception work that Finland and Sweden had a long historical relation at that borderland, and there is a long tradition of cross-border cooperation. And it helped a lot in this practical reception work. For example, the Swedish police were securing the work of Finnish volunteers at the Swedish sites, because third sector actors were able to cross the border and work at both sides of the border, while national state authorities had their authority only in their own country. So actually the examination at the local level pointed out that the tradition of open borders and interscalar and cross-border relations was very important for organizing the care and control practices. And it created a feeling of safety. And of course, there was also, at the beginning, there was this binational discussion and mistrust at the national level, and this tension between Finland and Sweden was actually illustrative of this larger EU solidarity crisis about conflicting interests and uneven distribution of responsibilities in the asylum reception. I know that similar kind of tensions has been present in many border regions, and now again during COVID we have seen this tension that the border closure and the control of mobilities is such a powerful method, and it impacts so many people in so harmful ways that it will create tensions also between the nations. So what are my conclusions? Well, we already know from the literature that this kind of threat discourses and securitization have a negative effect on migrants and ethnic minorities who already hold a legal status. and a residence permit in a country. And also we know that it has a negative effect on the societies as a whole. And yet in my study, I wanted to highlight that this border securitization is complex, and it's not a one-way state-driven process, but it's enacted by various actors and interest groups. And for these people, security can actually mean different things. And also the Tornio case showed that the state capacity to establish the code of conduct on border securitization or border security methods is dependent on cooperation, trust, and information sharing with various groups of actors, and also within borders, within nation states, and also across the border. And finally, I would like to highlight the paradox of state security efforts. For example, the tightened border control, because in the long term, they will erode trust relations within and across borders. And now we see this in Europe. And in the long term, this will weaken the state and social carrying capacity and security. That was something that was often border control and tightening of border control is justified in terms of security, but in the long term it may erode security and the resilience of European societies. Yes, so here is some research on that case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eeva-kaisa, for your presentation, beautifully illustrated. You can put your questions on the chat box so we can later on address them to our speakers. Now we'll pass the word to Ruben. Please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Great, well, thank you for the invitation, Fatima. It's great to see you. Such an exciting event. And thank you so much, Eeva-kaisa, for your very interesting presentation with such a rich case from northern Finland and the situation that's been going on there in the past few years, which of course reflects, as you've also, I think, shown, what's been happening elsewhere in Europe in recent years and even decades. And I guess that's what I'm gonna talk about. And apologies, I don't have any slides, but Eeva-kaisa's were so rich and helpful, so perhaps that will do for both of us. I will take us down to Southern Europe, closer to where most of you sit, to Southern Spain and North Africa, where I've been doing most of my ethnographic work over the past decade or more, on the so-called fight against illegal migration and border security put in place both by Spain and also by the EU as a whole in this part of the world, and at an escalating pace, of course, since 2015, as we already heard from Eeva-kaisa. So we'll pick up the ball there and around securitization and reflect a bit on that. When did this come about? What kind of migrations have been securitized here? What are the dynamics of the securitization in Southern Europe and in partner countries in Africa? What are the histories of that securitization, of those securitizations? And perhaps what are the futures of securitization, of migration, of human movement in this part of the world and in Europe more widely? So my focus when it comes to securitization as an ethnographer and anthropologist has been on what I've called the industry of border controls, the various actors who stand to gain something or make a livelihood from fighting migration, from securitizing migration in one way or another. And that includes many actors beyond the typical ones, law enforcement and so on. As Eeva-kaisa already highlighted, there are many forms of security and many kinds of securitizing actors out there. And very much like Eeva-kaisa as well, I'm very interested in looking at the practices more than, or in parallel perhaps with political discourses, to look at what's happening on the ground and how different actors, from the defense industry to law enforcement to partner regimes in neighboring countries, even include to NGOs, even academics, how many of these actors have come to play a role, wittingly or unwittingly, in securitizing migration and highlighting certain kinds of migration as a particular kind of problem and as a security problem. More recently, I've been working on border security in relation to wider security interventions, military intervention, counter-terror operations in the sub-Saharan Sahel region, in Mali in particular, where many of these security interventions kind of come together, a securitization multiple, again, if you will, Eeva-kaisa, but of a different kind, where counter-terror officials, border security agents, and others all work on different versions of security in a particular part of the world with particular colonial legacies attached. So where do I begin? Well, perhaps with my starting point, looking at this in my own research, which really has been, and again, this is also quite similar to what you've heard from Eeva-kaisa, the analysis and the voices of ordinary people who are really at the front line of this, including migrants themselves, frontline aid workers, and so on. So when I first started studying border security between Spain and Western North Africa, my initial research participants were deported migrants who had been trying to reach the Spanish Canary Islands in wooden fishing boats back in 2006 and been sent back home to their fishing communities in Senegal. They were telling me that migration was a big business. There's a lot of money in illegal migration, I kept being told. And it was made quite clear that I, among others, as a researcher, was one of a long line of visitors who were coming into these fishing communities in Senegal, trying to make a living out of the migrants and former migrants' misfortune, to put it bluntly. We did eventually become good friends, and we went well beyond that initial position. But that line of analysis really helped me to shift the gaze to look at the various actors involved in securitizing migration, in fighting migration. Not so much looking at the migrants themselves somehow in isolation, but rather using their analysis, migrants and former migrants analysis, to try to understand these very powerful sectors who are now all in one way or another collaborating in securitizing the borders of Europe and migration across it. And there we really, and I felt I really had to reflect very much on my position as an academic. My positionality in all sorts of ways was quite problematic. You had to straddle all sorts of borderlines. And perhaps that's something for discussion as well. How do we go about doing that kind of thing? But I think we cannot take ourselves as academics out of the picture. With the proliferation of research centers on migration, migration conferences, funding from the European Union and other actors coming into the field of migration studies, we have to ask ourselves, where are we situated in relation to these powerful actors and these attempts to securitize migration in Europe and beyond today? But anyway, let's head back a bit in history. Are we back in Spain now? And the commencement, if you will, of recent years, securitization of migration in Southern Europe. It's quite easy to forget. I guess we're all quite taken up by the immediate past and the present, where there's been so much happening, so many crises at the borders, so much violence and suffering, that it's easy to forget the longer trajectory of migration management and migration policy in Europe, where in fact in the post-war years we did not see, and perhaps I'm stating the obvious here, but we did not see the kind of widespread securitization of migration that we do today. At least not in the shape we're seeing it, and certainly not to the same level in political discourse and in practice. The first step towards really moving towards a security frame, I think most scholars would agree, happened around the 1970s with the oil crisis and the progressive closure of legal pathways for migrants from former colonies in Africa and elsewhere, and guest workers, say from Turkey into Germany. These pathways that had existed in the post-war years to some extent, certainly precarious, certainly unequal, certainly problematic in their own right, but at least they were there. And those pathways now started to close around this time in response to the economic crisis and the political situation at the time. We then saw, but still migration wasn't securitized properly, let's say, until the 1990s and the Schengen collaborations, the Schengen Agreement, and the Quest to institute free movement across Europe. And of course, Southern European countries are very keen on joining Schengen, joining the EU, and of course, then joining Schengen, Spain among them, and then saw that they were becoming part of a process that on the one hand, open movement, normalized mobility within the European space of freedom, security, and justice, while at the same time, that project of opening was dependent to a large extent on a closure to the outside. In a way, the reinvention and securitization of a non-European other, the reinforcement of the external border, standing in for wider cooperation on migration and asylum policy among European member states, which was still and still remains today, I would say, to some extent in its infancy. What everyone could agree on essentially on member state level was that we securitize the external borders, and then every member state does a bit of its own thing when it comes to migration from outside the EU, while we open up internally. So that's where we see this starting point really of the securitization of migration and the reinforcement of Southern European borders the way we see them today. And again, perhaps I'm stating the obvious here, apologies if so. The interesting thing is that we saw something similar happening around the world at this time. As the Berlin Wall came down, we started seeing walls going up on the US-Mexico border in the same decade under the Clinton administration. The supposed borderless world of globalization, or the post-Cold War era, was giving way bit by bit to a bit of a paradox, a world in which border security was becoming a globalized business. And we see that at an escalating pace in more recent years, from Saudi Arabia, its border with Yemen reinforced, to South Africa, similarly so to its northern neighbors, to India, Bangladesh border, to Israel, to Australia, and many other parts of the world. The global drive to securitizing migration really saw its seeds sown, planted there in the 1990s in the shape we know border security today, and is kept escalating ever since. And what we saw here was really very much like Eeva-kaisa was saying as well, this perverse underside to securitization, which is a generation of further insecurity through various means. And I'll talk a little bit about that next. The first thing that happened when Spain and also Italy were joining Schengen was that they instituted visa requirements for North Africans that until recently come across the border between Morocco and Spain, or Tunisia and Italy, worked perhaps in seasonal labor, gone back to Morocco at the end of the season, and that was that. They moved legally across borders, mobile lives of some sort. We shouldn't romanticize it, but at least there was, again, a legal pathway still in existence there, even at that late point. However, that now closed. Visa requirements were put in place. And it's no coincidence that precisely at that time when these visa requirements came into force, that we started to see increasing numbers of small fishing boats called pateras in Spain coming across the Strait of Gibraltar, leading to tragedies on beaches in southern Spain that were broadcast by the media. The first instances of a migration crisis were being born here. A legal pathway was being replaced by an irregular one. if we look globally, we see across the Atlantic, at least, we see the very same trend actually happening a few decades earlier, with the closure of legal pathways for seasonal workers, for laborers, agricultural laborers in the United States, closing down in the 60s. And pretty much immediately, it's quite astounding if you look at the statistics and the graphs, almost immediately being replaced by irregular labor. These were Mexican laborers who were already exploitable in a legal form, but were now even more so, even more vulnerable, even more exploitable once the legal pathways closed down. And of course, the same was now happening in Europe from the 1990s onwards at an escalating pace. And again, Spain illustrates this. As a former emigration country, well, after the financial crisis, it's kind of been a mixed picture with many Spaniards leaving again. But from the 1990s, certainly, we started seeing larger and larger influx of immigrants into Spain to change the migration dynamics there into more of an immigration country. The Spanish economy, of course, started to boom leading up to the financial crisis. There was a need for laborers in construction, in service sectors, in agriculture, and so on. And migrants were to play a role in that, including eventually migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa as well as North Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere in Europe. Now, as these irregular migration flows started to pick up pace in the 1990s, they were initially not very politicized. That securitization discourse we heard about from Eeva-kaisa wasn't really in play at that time. And someone who's written about this quite interestingly is Lorenzo Gabrielli in Barcelona, for those who are interested, going through that backstory. And as he says, and other authors as well, it was around the late 1990s, early 2000s, during the government of the conservative Partido Popular, that the Spanish state authorities and political actors starting in order to jump on the bandwagon of securitizing migration in the way that other Northern European states, West European states were doing from earlier years. They saw that they could make hay and reap some political rewards from similarly securitizing migration. Until then, the closure of the border, the securitization of the border was more of a convenient thing that had to be done now with the joining of Schengen, joining the EU as a good member state, being pressured by Northern European member states to do this work. But from this time onwards, the politicized securitization of migration was coming into force. At the same time, and again coming back to what Eeva-kaisa said about the multiple actors involved here, the defense sector, as well as law enforcement agencies, saw an opportunity here, in Spain as elsewhere, to present their solutions, their products, their work as somehow the golden ticket to solving this growing sense of migration crisis that the politicians had helped generate through their crisis discourse, through the securitized discourse. So these non-political actors, institutional actors, commercial actors were also actually playing a role in lobbying, in working behind the scenes to present their solutions, their security solutions as a way to deal with migration. And they were helped in no small part by the fact that interior ministries were increasingly taking on the portfolio of migration around this time. And so situating migration as a policing issue rather than, say, a labor issue sitting within a labor ministry or a social ministry. So there were many actors involved in securitizing migration through both discourse and practice, again, working sometimes in tandem, sometimes in a bit of conflict, but we started to see all those building blocks firmly in place by the early 2000s when these crises started to escalate. And as my initial research participants in Senegal had told me some years later, there was indeed plenty of money in fighting migration already at this time, but certainly in years to come. This was a growing pot of money. And despite the fact, we should never forget that irregular migration by land and sea is a very small proportion in any normal year outside 2015 relative to overall immigration into the EU. Even after a couple of big border crises in Spain in the late 2000s, a Spanish survey put the number of people that arrived, number of migrants that arrived by maritime routes at about 1% of the migrant population. These are small numbers, but we got big portfolio attached with big investments attached. So again, what then ensued here, and I write about this in my first book, Illegality, Inc., Clandestine Migration and the Business of Bordering Europe, that a bit of a vicious cycle set in, well, not even a bit, quite a strong vicious cycle set in, with more reinforcement led to further drama and crisis at the borders, which in turn led to even stronger calls for more controls. It was a vicious cycle that was also a virtuous cycle for many of the actors involved, who saw their investments being strengthened, who saw their political capital grow off the border crisis, and it could strengthen their institutional position within border and migration management, as was the case, for instance, with the Spanish Guardia Civil, the civil guard, who are in charge of border controls in Spain. And just to take an example of that, I think, Fátima, you mentioned Ceuta, the Spanish enclave in North Africa, at the beginning here, where we've seen dramatic events or crisis, if you will, in very recent times. Well, in 2005, this was actually one of the first big border crises of the European Union, where hundreds of undocumented sub-Saharan migrants tried to climb across an earlier version of the fences surrounding Ceuta and its sister enclave Melilla in North Africa, when some of them were shot down, some killed in the attempt by border guards, others expelled to the desert. And as a response to this entry attempt, Moroccan-Spanish border cooperation was heavily reinforced, pushing routes towards the Spanish Canary Islands, another destination that's seen big crises in the past year blossoming up again, and which had another version of that in 2006, about almost 15 years ago. So this all illustrates what we're seeing in 2020, 2021, and 2005, 2006, in these very same places, how this goes kind of in that circle, in that spiral. One kind of reinforcement leads to another route opening up, more drama at the borders, more calls for further reinforcements, and more political stoking of the emergencies. So we're stuck in that spiral of securitization that seems to be self-perpetuating time and time again. Now, what to do about that? It's a bit of a dire story I'm telling, and I've told it before, I've told it in my first book, and I'm increasingly thinking about what kind of alternatives can we find. I was really encouraged to hear Eeva-kaisa talk about the perception of the frontline aid workers or volunteers who were here seeing a very different story of migration playing out. And I think this is really where we have to start. And there are many such stories from migrants themselves in their communities, from frontline communities and volunteers. There is another story of migration out there, and it can be rescued, it can be reinvented. And I think key to that, in my view, and this again relates to what Eeva-kaisa talked about with the securitization multiple and so on, is to understand the dynamics of security from the inside out in a way, understand it in quite a sort of cold analytical way almost, the various interests, the vested interests that are now gathered up around reinforcing this border security system, as I've come to think about it. That keeps reinforcing itself through various kind of perverse feedback loops and incentives. Try to understand those incentives and feedback loops, and then build a coalition of some kind to find a way forward and a way out. We've seen examples of that, for instance, in the fight back against the war on drugs, by a range of actors, from governments in South America to communities, civil society organizations, academics, NGOs. These kinds of coalitions are possible and may come to involve actors within destination states in Europe, who sometimes, including in Spain, have talked about migration in very different terms. Let's remember that Spain, among many other Southern European countries, is swiftly aging. And like it or not, there will be a need for workers. There will be a need to deal with migration in a different way in future. So a coalition of some sort through which an understanding of what reinforces the security system politically and economically may be used as a way of finding an alternative and of highlighting where the costs are falling in the present, because the costs of this system and the benefits are very unequally portioned out, just as they have been in the war on drugs, just as they have been in the climate crisis. We can take a range of examples, the war on terror, etc. I could talk more, but I think I'm going to end it there. And to return us to history as well, I think that's another element we shouldn't forget here. And that's kind of what I've been looking at in my more recent book, No-Go World. The histories of securitization, the histories of targeting particular population with a clear racialized element to them, a clear colonial element to these securitized operations. What can we learn from earlier historical periods? What is a repetition or a continuation of the past in some version? What is perhaps different now, including in terms of the power relations between African and European states? I think there are things that are different. There are things, in fact, that are different today that may help to build precisely those coalitions in conversation, not least with African voices, politicians, and civil society. So I'll end it there for now, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruben, for this amazing presentation. Now we turn to our guests in the room. Also, we have some questions here. I will read it. Can a comparison be established between European northern countries' migration policy management and the European southern country migration policy, or both realities are totally distinct and cannot be compared? Does the European Union has a responsibility in the emergence of far-right movements and parties which usually adopt anti-migration positions? And Ruben, Eva, would you like to?
You want to start, Eeva-kaisa?
Yes, I can start. Thank you very much for this question. It is a very important question. Of course, European Union has this integrated border management. European Union has common external borders, but at the moment the pressure is at the Southern Europe and the Mediterranean road. It's very lethal road. And of course, Finland has a EU external border, long border with Russia. And there is always this threat that Russia can kind of put pressure on that border, like Turkey is doing, or Morocco was doing in Spain, that it's a political weapon, so to say. And in 2016, there was actually around 2,000 migrants through Russia. But at the moment, the pressure is at the Mediterranean and in Northern Africa. And then we come to this very important political question, that what is the responsibility and the solidarity within Europe, and how we could share the responsibility for refugees. But I'm sorry, I cannot say so much about that. Yes. And the far right movements, it's very, very big question in Europe, in many countries. I don't know, perhaps Ruben, perhaps you have something
Sure.
to add.
Thank you, Eeva-kaisa. Thanks for the questions. So I guess there are many things we could potentially talk about here around, I guess, the politics between European member states at a time when the external borders have been Europeanized to a very large extent, while migration and asylum policies have not to a large extent. And of course, there have been moves in that direction to streamline, though it's still, we see that struggle around solidarity, around very different regimes for asylum status determination and so on. So this is a recurring problem, of course, we know since 2015, and it really hasn't been solved at all by pushing this down the securitization route. What that has done in a way is kicking things not even into the long grass, but into the short grass maybe. So we kick the can down the road a bit and hope the problem goes away. And in the meantime, we're not doing very much at all to get our house in order and to actually build some common shared understanding of how to handle migration and asylum among European countries, which are of course in very different political positions, with very different economic conditions, and with very different migratory and historical contexts. And we shouldn't forget here migrants' own agency, besides the political agency of states. Where they might want to go may not at all correspond to some solidarity scheme dreamed up on a European level, even if European states were to agree to this, which of course we've seen is very difficult. So it's hard even to start to pick this apart. But I guess one thing that we've seen in recent years, and already actually since the 90s in the case of Spain, as I said, is some degree of convergence in the kind of securitized discourses between Northern and Southern Europe, though of course in very different historical contexts and in context of very different labor markets, so on. And some of this has been worsened, I think, very much so by this way in which securitization, as border security, has been Europeanized. This fight against migration has been handled on a higher supranational level. We can take the case of Greece, for instance, which has essentially been turned into a buffer zone, very much as Northern African countries have been, a site of immense suffering, where suffering, in fact, is being used as a deterrence for migrants, and also for the Greek population and society to really close their border in a much harder way and impose even harder deterrence against refugees and migrants within Greece. So some very cynical politics going on here between different parts of the European Union, and between, of course, the EU and its neighbors, that I'm sure we could talk more about. The second question I need to remind myself on about the far-right parties. Yes, certainly, I would say yes, the EU has played a role here in a way abetting these sentiments, partly simply because these border security operations, these attempts to securitize migration haven't worked. They're generating a set of unpredictable, let's say, non-linear effects. I'm thinking of this as a security system, as I said. One of them being that once you talk about migration in terms of security, various political actors, as we heard from Eeva-kaisa as well, can start picking up on this in their own way. And fomenting an even stronger sense of crisis, whether it's far-right opposition, or indeed government figures, as we've seen in Italy, or more mainstream governments who also see this as very useful. So we're seeing that escalation of rhetoric, that escalation of crisis and discourse going on. But we also see escalation in practice, because these security operations have, more often than not, led to even more of a chaotic situation, with violent pushbacks, with neighboring states, partner regimes such as Morocco, Libya, as we heard from Eeva-kaisa, using migration as a political bargaining chip to put pressure on Europe. That's what we saw in Ceuta, this enclave, very recently. Spain, Morocco opening the border to force Spain into political concessions of some sort. So here again, this move towards securitizing migration, which of course is not just about the EU, it's about its member states fundamentally, has come back to bite them to a large extent.
Okay, thank you. I will, Lara, please open your mic. Lara will present her own question.
Okay, thank you. And thank you both for your great presentations. It's just easier for me to ask than to write. So it's not really my research area, but I'm interested in these topics. So given that, from what I understood, given that the evidence shows that to a large extent, migration is unstoppable, migration in general, given that legal migration tends to be substituted by illegal migration, as I said, to a large extent, not totally, but what supports or keeps supporting securitization? I mean, from what I understand, I mean, there is no evidence to support it. I mean, it seems like it doesn't work. It doesn't play out the way it should. If only it makes things worse. And so, how are these policies? How they keep continuing being supported? And do you think that this is somehow related to, you know, this? How can I say, this larger discourse on that people don't care about facts anymore? Like, imagine that people already know that these policies don't work, but it doesn't matter. So they keep implementing them anyway, because facts don't matter anymore. We see this in several other issues, right? So, because I remember that, for instance, in economics, there's loads and loads of evidence showing that migrants do not steal the jobs of native people. I mean, there's loads of evidence, and still there is this this idea that prevails, that that the migrants steal the jobs of, and so it seems like no matter how much science or you know, and the researchers and show that actually things are not exactly like that, it seems like it doesn't matter. So that's my question. Sorry.
Okay, please. Anyone? Eeva?
I can try to answer shortly, but I would actually like to refer to Ruben's excellent presentation and he was taking up this question of the security sector and the money. So of course, this is big business also, and just like war industry, border infrastructure, and this infrastructure and the players and big industries are involved, and also security sector can show that we have this threat to get more resources from the governments, and it's presented as a solution to all kind of problems. This is, I think, one structural question. And other one is perhaps that not all migrants are treated and seen as a threat. Some migrants are wanted, and we have to ask what that tells about us and our societies in terms of who is wanted and who is not wanted, and who is worth protection and who is not. And I think xenophobia and racism and this kind of fear towards otherness are also behind there. Yes, I think these two things came to my mind.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you, Eeva-kaisa. I would agree with those being two main factors. There are many political and economic benefits, as I was alluding to before, to continuing with this, even when it keeps producing disastrous results. We see this again in something like the war on terror, war on drugs, where we see billions upon billions, even trillions of dollars spent by the United States, simply in criminalizing populations when it comes to the war on drugs, with immense human suffering as a consequence, without changing the underlying structures, the dynamics of the drug trade, the supply and demand. And something similar is happening with migration. And I think what Eeva-kaisa said, that we need to really look at the bigger picture here. What kind of migration is seen as acceptable, and which kinds of migration are being securitized? Race, colonial histories, class all come into play here in different ways, perhaps across different European countries. But that debate does need to happen, and perhaps within that debate there could be a sort of seed for a more, let's say, rational scientific debate around what the drivers of migration, understanding those in a structural sense, and trying to work with those drivers rather than against them in a way, by simply trying to halt migration that may continue regardless. But I wanted to go back to the point around migration being unstoppable and border security not working. Of course, when you speak to policymakers, and I've done this, I presented reports on why border security is not the way to go. They say, well, actually, from 2015 onwards, it kind of works. You know, no one wants to reopen this. No European government wants to reopen this at all. They think it works. Yes, migration is still occurring, and yes, perhaps 2021 is showing that it doesn't fully work, but still that containment of migration, of suffering, of people at the other side of some border, whether it's Libya or Greece, Turkey, etc., to some extent in the short term can be seen to work. So we also need to take seriously, I think, the timeline here. What works in the short term, politically in the electoral cycle, may be inimical to the long term, and to looking at this in a much more rational and scientific sense. But of course, politics works in the short term, and this is where we end up getting stuck. I think also that governments do have a role in channeling and even fomenting migration. There was this sense, particularly in the pre-COVID years, that migration is this thing that will just continue and continue at these levels, whatever we do. And I think scholars, as well as others, the members of the public, I think we're increasingly opening our eyes to the fact that governments do have a pretty big role to play in fomenting those flows, in putting in place recruitment channels and so on. That a globalization we've been used to is not a sort of natural course of things, it's dependent on a very particular political arrangement. So clearly there are things that may change there and move in a very other direction, and maybe towards another kind of protection framework. I'm thinking in these terms today, rather than a security framework that could be a benefit to those working within labor markets in Europe, as well as newcomers alike. But I think we're a long way from getting there at present.
Okay, we have another question from Tania. Question to both guest speakers. Thank you so much for your enlightening presentation. My question actually concerns methodology used to study issues such as migration, borders, and securitization. You both use the narrative and storytelling as methodological tool in your research, and somehow you felt the need to write about such option for being such a sensitive as well as powerful tool for understanding this complex context, and the destructive and productive emotions, fear on the one side and the positive perceptions of the frontline workers on the other, which unfold in border interventions. I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on this. Thank you. Storytelling, is that so, right, Tania? Okay, both speakers who would like to.
I feel like I've talked a lot.
You did not. It was great.
Just a couple of words. I mean, I'm very keen on storytelling. I think it's a marvelous tool for academics or whoever wants to write about the world around us. And it's also, of course, part of what we're studying. Narratives of the political world, narratives of migration. Stories are constantly being told of what this migration means for the future of our societies, whether it's a threat and where that threat is coming from. So storytelling is key in a way to what we've been talking about here, securitization. And so in a way, there may be a way within storytelling of taking those stories seriously in a research sense, but then also finding a way, or perhaps speaking back or creating another kind of story, or perhaps a set of multiple interweaving stories that present another picture or map of the world. So that's very much part of my own research from the beginning, and certainly in my latest book, No Go World, I play quite a lot with it. Whether we succeed or not is another story, but we have to keep trying. And yeah, I'd be really keen to hear from anybody else who's working in this narrative sense.
Okay. Okay, we have Eeva-kaisa, you have a question for Ruben, is that so?
Yes, I was writing it down. Well, yeah, can I ask the question now?
Yes. Please.
So last year I was working in a project on climate migration, and I think there are many threat narratives towards climate change and environmental change, and now climate migration. So I would like to ask Ruben, who is an expert of Northern African situation and politics, and also Southern Europe, and all you are more experts on Southern Europe than I am. So how do you see climate migration in terms of security and securitization? Are there a lot of discourses and narratives arising around that question?
Thank you. We should keep this conversation going after today as well. It's fantastic. We're starting these research conversations. I'm increasingly interested. I had a student actually recently wrote about climate migration and these routes into the Spanish Canary Islands, and how ideas of climate change and climate crisis are playing into people's journeys, but also into the political reception of these movements and so on. I think we've seen, I mean, this kind of started a few decades ago, didn't it? This sort of doomsday scenarios of hundreds of millions of climate refugees setting out on the road to Europe and the West. Norman Myers from here in Oxford was one of the people who wrote about this very early on. Other NGOs jumped on that ship, and we've seen more of that in more recent times. And I guess in academia, it's been a bit of a pushback against that idea, and to focus rather on mobility and immobility, to show in a much more complex way how climate change may lead to all sorts of patterns of mobility and adaptations locally more than internationally, for instance, and may also trap populations rather than set them on the road. So we're starting to see, we've had that bit of a standoff, I guess, between these big doomsday scenarios in part of the policy world and academics saying, well, hey, actually it's more complex and you're just securitizing migration all over again. So I think some of that is certainly happening in Southern Europe, this idea that we're going to keep seeing, as was told to me at the time in my fieldwork, Africa pushing upwards through demographic pressures, climate pressures, conflict, economic difficulties, and so on. So clearly there's a need to move out of that kind of mindset here. And I'm relatively optimistic, I think, when it comes to climate discourse, that there are strong currents within those policy spheres and civil society that are looking at mobility in a much more normalized sense as part of an adaptation strategy. That comes with its own problems. For instance, a blind spot when it comes to climate justice. But I think that these debates are getting quite intricate, and I can imagine Spain in particular being a very interesting case in point in coming years, given climate pressures within Spain itself, and of course within neighboring countries. But I guess a lot of this is still in gestation, but perhaps someone else in the room has more thoughts on this.
Thank you. Now, Gianmarco, please open your mic.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm having some problem with the connection. I hope you can hear me properly.
Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for your presentations. I have a question for Ruben Andersson. I am a student of a PhD program in anthropology, and I'm also researching about migration, and your work is of course a big inspiration for me, so I'm very happy to talk to you this evening. I have a question which is not directly about securitization. It is maybe about the other side of the phenomenon, about autonomy of migration. I am curious to know more about what is happening to those migrants that reach Europe despite all dangers and barriers deployed by the European border regime. Particularly, I would like to know if migrants that are hosted in Spanish governmental reception programs try also to abandon the hosting facilities to prosecute their journeys and their migration plans in other countries. And I would like to know, I know more about this phenomenon happening in Italy and in Portugal, where I'm doing my PhD. And I would like to know more about this happening in Spain, and if there is academic writing or press talking about this phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianmarco. It would be interesting to hear how your research progresses. It sounds very, very interesting and very timely. Perhaps I'm not best placed to say what's happening right now in Spain. I've been so caught up in 2 years of COVID teaching like everyone else. I'm not on top of all the latest, though I have students, like I said, working on these irregular migrations in Spain at the moment. They are certainly seeing that there is a lot of movement of this kind, and there has been for a long time. I remember already 10 years ago when I was in the Canary Islands, in Ceuta, in Andalusia, how people were constantly shuffling through the system in various ways. Yes, they were blocked along the way, but eventually they tended to find their way. Sometimes that way went from, say, a reception center, is a bit similar, I think, in Italy, then I have this hotspot system, to perhaps a detention center for deportation, and then they spent their time in deportation centers, or detention centers, the FIES in Spain. They were released at the end of that with an expulsion order, and then off they went, either into the labor market in Spain or further north. And I stayed in touch with many migrants who had moved from southern Spain into the north of Spain, or into France, into Germany, and we kept calling each other afterwards from various locations across Europe. So Spain in this sense was a transit country. And even many of the officials themselves were keenly aware of that, to the extent that I heard reception center directors pretty much giving advice on how to get to the next step of the journey, or to cross the Strait of Gibraltar into mainland Spain from Ceuta, for instance. A slightly bizarre situation, which again we've seen in other Southern European countries. So the authorities quite happily looking the other way and sort of setting people on the road somehow. So I think this is another very interesting part of what's going on. And coming back to that earlier question, the dynamics between different European countries clearly comes into play here, because when there is no functioning shared mechanisms on interstate level, well then ordinary people and workers will try to find other ways of instituting some form of, perhaps, if not fairness, at least some flex in the system, given how the system is not set up to really be aligned with what people, or indeed border communities, feel they need. But it's a very interesting question, and I hope to hear more about it later.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I would like to thank you enormously for your kindness in coming here and sharing your research with us. It was two beautiful presentations, very interesting. Thanks to our audience who had such interesting questions to pose to our speakers. And I hope we can keep on chatting about these issues, which are really so important and so interesting for all of us who are here today. Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Eeva-kaisa. Open it again very, very soon, and we can continue to talk. Thank you for all your for the presence of you all. Thank you.
Thank you,
Fatima. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.